Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be going over nephrons and the kidneys. Once again, my name is Cha Cha. And like you, I'm a student that's studying for the MCAT, so there may be some mistakes in my videos, but please, if there are, let me know in the comments because I'm also a student and I want to know if I made any mistakes because that'll impact my studying too. Okay, so here's my beautiful picture of the nephron. So I have my arteries, which are in red. I have the primary one, which is the renal artery, and then I have the arterioles, which will kind of branch off. And then they'll go into the glomerulus, which is part of Bowman's capsule, which is the first part of the nephron. And then I have here the proximal convoluted tube, proximal meaning it's close, like as in like close to the renal artery, close to the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule. And then in light blue, I'll have the renal veins. And then in purple, I'll kind of have where the veins and the arteries where they mix, I guess, the capillaries, which is blue and red combined is purple. Then I have the descending loop with Henle, and then I have the ascending loop with Henle, and then the distal convoluted tubule. So distal as in it's further away from that glomerulus and Bowman's capsule. And then I have my collecting duct, which together it'll form the ureters of a whole bunch of the collecting ducts for each independent nephron. And nephron is sort of like the independent unit for the kidneys. And it'll come together, they'll form the ureters and go to the bladder where the waste, also known as urine, can be stored. So on the top, I have the cortex of the kidney, then I have the outer medulla, and then the inner medulla. Then one last thing I kind of want to point out beforehand. So this is a countercurrent multiplier system. So you're probably thinking, at least when I was first learning about the kidneys, this is like really confusing to me. Like, what the heck is this app? Like, what does it mean? So breaking down, I was like, whenever you see like a long term like that, just like breaking it down. So it's like counter. So that means it's against, right? Current multiplier system. So it's like it's kind of like they're going against each other. So like the waste products in the blood, they're moving in opposite directions. So this means that the loop in the blood, they're constantly trying to find equilibrium. So if you go back to Le Chatelier's principle, right? So it's like if you were to increase one, like your reactants versus your products, right? You'll shift directions. So it's the same thing with your filtrates and your blood because they're trying to maintain that equilibrium. So if you have a bunch of ions that is in your blood, then you're going to want to have your water that'll like flow in. So you're going to try and decrease, or you're going to try and dilute, if that makes sense, since you want everything to be in equal concentrations. And that is why this exists. It also allows the kidneys to have great control over your osmolarity, um, which I'll go more into that in a little bit too, if that was a little confusing. Which this is it's a beast. The nephron is very confusing. For me, this is like the one of the more confusing units in the Kaplan book to learn. So first let's go over Bowman's capsule. So once again, Bowman's capsule, that's like the first part of the nephron that interacts with arteriole for the renal artery. And it is where, yeah, as I was keep saying, it's where the renal artery first comes into contact with the nephron. So this is where there's hydrostatic pressure at play. So there's two main forces that you need to be aware of, which are hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure, or oncotic pressure, I should say. I don't know why I said osmotic. It's oncotic. Oopsies. And oncotic pressure, together those make up the Starling forces, and they're constantly kind of at war with each other. So one may be greater than the other, and in this case, the glomerulus has increased hydrostatic pressure, which forces liquid into the nephron. So it has a greater oncotic pressure than the space in the Bowman's capsule. which just like holds, I guess, the arterioles, and it'll force it in. The fluid will go into the nephron. So what I kind of like to think about hydrostatic pressure is kind of like squeezing a water bottle, right? I kind of have this crude image, so imagine this is sort of a water bottle. Like if you like you accidentally like sit on a water bottle, I'm sure maybe it hasn't happened to everyone, but it's happened to me a couple of times where you sit on that water bottle and all of a sudden you're just like kind of increasing the pressure and on that water bottle because it has less volume, like less area for it to move. So you're like kind of shooting the liquid like outwards. And that's sort of the same thing that you could think about for hydrostatic pressure. So it's the force that's being excreted by the fluid against its container wall. So if you're going from a large to a small space, which is like happening in Bowman's capsule, for example, then you're going to force a fluid into that open space, which is the nephron. So, and then oncotic pressure is like the movement of fluids related to the ions. So this is more or less what I was trying to explain with like equilibrium. So like if you have increased, yeah, let me draw like a little fluid. So this is a permeable membrane only for water. Let's have in blue. Okay, never mind. Let's have that in blue. And then I'll have, let's say this has like four, this only has one. So in order to so water like it flows in the concentration of the greater ion concentrations because it wants to have the concentration be the same. Your body always craves equilibrium. So it wants to have maintain the same concentration no matter where it is in your body. So this is like, as we'll see in a little bit, that's just like another driving force of the kidney in water reabsorption. So for the proximal convoluted tube, remember, just reorienting ourselves, proximal convoluted tube, that's proximal as in relating to Bowman's capsule. It's in close proximity. That's another way that you could kind of think about it. And the proximal convoluted tube is this where essential materials in the body, where it's reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So like glucose, you also have like your vitamins and amino acids. So it's just like stuff that accidentally got into, well, not accidentally, but like it had no choice but was forced to go into the filtrate in the nephron. So this is the first pit stop. So it's like, oh, the body's like, no, I don't really like want to lose that just because it's like it's necessary for the body to function. So then it just gets reabsorbed. And then there's some other stuff too. So sodium that is also reabsorbed. And then as I was saying with the oncotic forces too, right? So water that also gets reabsorbed as well because it's following that sodium ion concentration. Chlorine can also be reabsorbed too, just because it's less concentrated outside. And then yeah, and the interstitium. So interstitium space is kind of like the space in between. So it's like not in the blood, but it's like the space in the kidneys. That's called the interstitium space. Um, which and then can the ions can then go back into the bloodstream and all of the important stuff that we're talking about that gets reabsorbed. So first it goes into interstitium space and then it goes into the bloodstream, into the circulatory system again. Another thing to keep in track. Also, the kidneys are a major regulator of your body's pH. So, like hydrogen or like protons, they can get reabsorbed or depending on like the your body's pH. So your body, I always like to think about it as a special snowflake. Our ideal pH is around 7.4. So it will do as much as it can in order to keep that. So it'll either like, let's say, for example, like your body is really acidic. So like when you have lots of acids mean sorry, when your body's acidic, that means that you have a lot of high proton concentration. So your body's going to want to excrete more of those protons compared to, like, let's say your body is like more basic, then less protons will get excreted in the proximal convoluted tube. And we'll see as well, the distal convoluted tubule also excretes protons. Another thing is urea. So this is the body's main form of waste that it has that it can transport to the kidneys for the sole purpose of being excreted, because too much too much nitrogen in your body is deadly, and it can lead to harmful intermediates and blocking chemical processes. Another more harmful form of this is ammonium, um, which is, yeah, more harmful. So some of the examples that I have for blocking chemical processes is so when you have like excess glutamate, it's same thing with like sugar, right? Like that's the main thing with like diabetes, which can cause neuropathy or like dead nerves, is because like everything will just get glycosylated because you have excess sugar. Your body doesn't know what to do with it. So it's like, okay, let me just like keep like basically spamming sugar onto like these molecules that don't necessarily need it. And it can cause a lot of problems, primarily like neuropathy. So that's why a lot of diabetics, like they don't have feeling in their feet if they don't manage their diabetes properly. Another example of this is the same thing with nitrogen. So like if you have like glutamate, um, to glutamine, so it's just like an add on, since like that's the primary difference, is that instead of two oxygens that are bonded to that terminal carbon, which I have in blue as well, it'll have an amine group instead. So it's just like your body doesn't know what to do, so it just keeps adding and adding nitrogen onto glutamate. And glutamate, if you remember, it's really important in the brain because it's an excitatory neurotransmitter. It's really important too, like, yeah, for NMDA and AMPA, those are the two primary receptors for glutamate in the brain. So if you don't have as much glutamate in the brain, then everything is kind of thrown out of whack. And also GABA too, because glutamate and GABA, they kind of counteract each other. So just pretty much like your brain doesn't have like the right processes that it needs to, because GABA is kind of more in control than glutamate is. It kind of throws the whole body out of focus because GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter. That makes sense. Also, I want to make sure that so sodium potassium pumps, those are in the distal and proximal convoluted tubules. So if you remember from like neurons in general, so sodium potassium pump is 3 sodiums out, 2 potassiums in. So like kind of think of like the water movement, right? So water pretty much always gets like reabsorbed. It's never getting into the nephron. So think about it that way, right? Like for if you're like trying to think, oh my gosh, like I can't remember, is it 3 Na plus out or is it 2 Na plus out? Think, oh yeah, it's totally gonna be 3 because you want to have the interstitium space be more concentrated so that water can flow due to that oncotic pressure, right? Since like water always follows the ion concentration because it wants to maintain equilibrium. So like if there's more ions, right? Going back to my crudely drawn image, if there's more ions, right, water's going to follow it so that it can maintain equilibrium. So, and then 2K plus in. So also we'll get more into like aldosterone, which has a major effect on sodium concentration, which is also like how I can remember that sodium is what's going out, is because aldosterone is what controls for the sodium permeability, which I will talk more about in a little bit. And then potassium is. So it's like this is the same thing in the neuron too, right? Since it's like this is for neurons too. I don't know why I drew, but that's another way. So sodium is always high on the outside in concentration, whereas K plus is high on the inside. So that's another way you can think about it. It's just like relating it back to the neuron. So the sodium potassium pump will always be, it'll be the same thing, like for what's going in and out, and it's the same amount of like per. So it's like 3 Na plus. will go out into K plus in. So it's going against that concentration gradient because sodium potassium pumps are ATPases, which is a fancy way of saying that it needs ATP for a conformational change. But anyway, I think I kind of went a little rambled on to that, but in my neuron video, I kind of go more in depth on the sodium potassium pump because it's just really important in a ton of different bodily functions. Now let's go into the loop of Henle, which has a descending part here, and then it has an ascending part. So in the descending loop, so always remember like water is always like going out or reabsorbed when the fluid moves down, and it is unable to be reabsorbed when fluid moves up. That's kind of how I remember what goes, like what ions go, or like what molecules are reabsorbed versus go into the filtrate, et cetera, just because there's a lot going on in the kidney. So it can kind of be hard to keep your head track of everything. And this leads to the waste being more concentrated, right? Because you're losing water, so that means that, like for example, like if you have like this is going to be like our molarity, right? So like you have 100, let's say whatever liters, and then you have like 10 grams of solutes, and then you still have the same amount of solute, right? But now you have 50. So that's a big change, right? Yeah, it's the same thing. So like for concentration, it's going to be more concentrated because you're not changing the amount of solute or ion concentration that you have. You're only changing the sheer amount of volume for your solvent, so that water. So therefore, it's going to be more concentrated. And this is like, it's important so the kidney can control like the osmolarity and how much water is reabsorbed based on how dehydrated you are. And also, this is going back to, as I was saying up here, it's a countercurrent multiplier system. So your blood is hypertonic. So hyper meaning like excess, whereas hypo is like you're lacking. I guess that's kind of what I like to think about it. So when you have hypertonic, tonic kind of sounds like ionic. So you have a lot of ions in your blood. So that means that the water is, because your body is always trying to maintain equilibrium, right? So your water will flow out of the nephron to get reabsorbed into the interstitium space because it wants to maintain equilibrium, 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 equilibrium. When in doubt, equilibrium it out. That's like always going to be the answer. And then we have the ascending loop of the loop of Henle. And this is only permeable to salts. So that Na plus Cl minus. This is due to, as I was saying, hypotonic blood. Because like there is low concentration of like salts in the blood. So that means that the sodium and chlorine, they will leave to try and make it more hypertonic because your body wants to be equilibrium, and water this time isn't going to follow. So that's important to keep in mind. But this comes back into play for the collecting duct because the collecting duct fluid is moving down, so it's going down towards the ureters, down towards the bladder, right? So the more sodium and chlorine that you release in this step, then that means like the more water that will get reabsorbed in the collecting duct. So right now water can't get reabsorbed, but it's important in the future. Same with the distal convoluted tubule too. So it's the same as the proximal duct and like what goes in and what comes out, but there's a couple of key changes. So you're no longer reabsorbing amino acids, glucose, and vitamins because those have already been, or at least primarily they've already been reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted tubule. And then so like, for example, like Na plus Cl minus in water, they're still reabsorbed. Well, protons, potassium, and ammonia, they're excreted. And then also, this is where aldosterone comes into play too, because aldosterone is a steroid. So when you increase reabsorption of sodium, you are subsequently increasing the water that's getting reabsorbed. Because remember, everything wants to maintain equilibrium. So if you have something that's more concentrated, then your water is going to come in to try and make it more like more dilute, whereas subsequently you're also increasing the concentration of where your water was flowing from. So in this case, you're like filtering. That makes sense. Yeah. So it's also a steroid too. So that's why I highlighted the own. So like whenever you see like an own or an all, chances are it's a steroid. And then the collecting tube, that's kind of the last thing I want to talk about. Or the collecting duct, collecting tube, whatever you want to call it. This is where water is getting reabsorbed because remember, collecting duct is going down, 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 down to the ureter. So it can get stored, the filter can get stored in your bladder, and then you could excrete it through your like waste, like when you pee it out. And then here I kind of have more into like the regulation. So like remember, steroids are slow because they go inside of the cell and then they can act as transcription factors. But because that they're slow, right? And they're long acting, there's lots of regulation that can be in place. So for example, for aldosterone, this is kind of you don't really need to remember like the certain steps of aldosterone, but just remember that aldosterone is like the steroid, so that means that there's more steps that go into it than ADH, since ADH is a peptide hormone. And so for example, like renin, it cleaves angiotensogen. I can never say any of the names. Oh my God. And I only say them in my head when I read it. And then so this can come in and then it can kind of like have the signaling sequence that occurs. So then it can activate angiotensin 1, which is a peptide, which can then turn into angiotensin 2, and then angiotensin 2, which is also a peptide. It can activate the adrenal cortex. So how I like to remember like how is aldosterone, what how when you're looking at the adrenal glands, what activates what. So the AC, it's literally in the name, as I like to say. So your androgens and aldosterone will be activated here, whereas cortisol will also be activated here as well. That those are unrelated to this, but that's kind of all I want to touch about on that. And then ADH, which stands for antidiuretic hormone, which I don't know. Um, so diuretic, meaning kind of like I like to think about it as like peeing. So it's like anti, so it's like you're stopping peeing hormone. So that means that water is going to get reabsorbed. So this does it through a different pathway. So this is a peptide hormone. So that means it's fast acting and it has less like it's like fast acting and it's also like doesn't act as long. So it reabsorbs water via aquaporins, so it's increasing the amount of aquaporins, which are on the collecting duct. So only on the collecting duct. And also another key distinguishing factor between ADH and aldosterone is increasing sodium permeability, whereas ADH is only increasing the amount of water that is reabsorbed. But both of them, they have an impact on blood pressure because you're increasing the amount of water that's reabsorbed, right? So you're increasing the volume of your blood. I mean, so your blood pressure is going to increase, which makes sense, right? Because like you're increasing the volume while the area stays the same. And then so I forgot to say aquaporins are a passive type of water transporter. That's all I kind of wanted to say on the nephrons. Hopefully that was not too confusing, but nephrons, don't feel bad if you don't get it right away because it took me a long time to understand the nephrons. So you're totally not alone. But hopefully I didn't make too many mistakes in this video. Um, yeah, I'll see you next time.